Hey guys, I'm Papa Pete and welcome to today's episode of The 125. The 125 is my web-based YouTube show focusing on the 125 original games that were released for the Intellivision System between 1979 and 1989. It's not really a regular type of web show because actually each episode consists of more than one video. First of all, you have the review and history video. That's the one you're watching right now. And then there'll also be an accompanying gameplay video, which is some uninterrupted gameplay from the game that I'm talking about this one. And today's game, one of the very first ones ever released for the Intellivision, an all-time classic board game, I'm going to be talking about Checkers by Mattel Electronics. So sit back, here we go. Before starting today's episode, I'd like to give a special thank you to the 125's official sponsor, IntellivisionCollector.com. Intellivision Collector is your one-stop for anything that you need for your Intellivision collection. With over 730 items currently listed on the site, you'll find not only lots of games, but systems and hardware, as well as repair parts, things like power and main boards, system shells, RF adapters, and even controller rebuild kits. Intellivision Collector is also currently in negotiation with several of the major players in the Intellivision homebrew community, so hopefully, one day soon, it'll be the primary location where you can find all the classic as well as the newest releases from all Intellivision homebrew creators. The site has had many recent additions and is updated regularly, so be sure to check out IntellivisionCollector.com. Checkers is an absolutely ancient game that dates back as far as the 10th century, where it was originally known by its Arabic name, Al-Kirka. It developed over the centuries, over the years. It was brought up into Europe where it further evolved, and later on it became known, especially in Great Britain, as drafts. It's actually still known as drafts in Great Britain today. Well, in the 1600s, maybe 1700s, when it all come over, people started moving over to North America. In the American society, like a lot of terms from Europe, it got changed and it became known as the game of checkers, which was one of the very first games that almost every kid, right up until about the current generation, learned to play when they were really young. In the early days of video games, when AI was just being developed and one-player games were really kind of rare, every gaming system seemed to almost be obligated to bring these classic board games into their system. Board games such as chess and Othello, card games such as poker and blackjack, and yes, even games like checkers, all had to be brought on to the very first video game systems such as the Fairchild Channel F, the Bally Astrocade, the Atari 2600, or yes, even the Intellivision. When you think about it, there's two very good reasons for developing and bringing these classic games onto the computer systems back at the time, the home consoles. And first of all, remember, these were very well-known games. The strategies were very well-known, and they were just trying to develop the AI. So as they developed AI, it was much easier to measure their successes by concentrating on games that were so well-known, that were so well-studied over the years, like chess, like checkers. But speaking of well-known, the other factor I think that is very important is back in the 70s when video game systems were just being introduced into our society. Of course, the younger generation really were interested in them, but the older generation couldn't really relate to video games in general. Nowadays, when people my age who have kids and they want video games, well, I knew what it was like to have a video game when I was a kid, and I can understand that. But back in the day, the 70s, when I wanted a video game, my parents didn't understand that. So by having games such as chess and checkers and other card games on the system, it let them relate to these video game systems, let them recognize some aspect of it, so they'd be more inclined to pick it up and introduce their children to it. After video games became more of a fixture in our society, these connections became less and less important. So you rarely, if ever, see checkers in a modern-day video game system, at least as a standalone. And even in the days of the NES, you're much more likely to see the licensed properties from Nintendo in a true board game than you were to see it the other way around. Now, of all these board games, I would say that chess is probably the exception, but then again, you still see it much less frequently than you used to back in those days. Checkers for Intellivision was produced by APH Technological Consulting, as were many of the games back in that day, and it was released on September 17th, 1980. It was programmed by David Rolfe, who also programmed Major League Baseball, right here, as well as Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack, a couple of the M Network titles for Atari. I think it was Super Challenge Baseball and Frogs and Flies. But probably most notably, he is the creator of the exec-ROM, which is the operating system under which the Intellivision actually runs, exec.bin. Overall, David Rolfe was one of the most important computer programmers in the original development of the Intellivision system. As far as gameplay goes, where do we begin? It's checkers. We've all played checkers. Each player starts with 12 men and a 8x8 black and red checkerboard. It's very common, the red and black color scheme, and it's the one that they use in the Intellivision. What is a little bit more unusual, though, is that the Intellivision also uses a team of white men and a team of blue men. It doesn't really matter. Those colors actually stand out very well against the background. The object of the game is to move your checkers diagonally using only the black squares and strategically position yourself so you can jump the opponent's checkers and try to capture them all, removing them from the board. The first person that can take the last of their opponent's checkers or put them in a position where they can no longer move wins the game. Now I'm going to jump on a gameplay for a second just to talk a little bit about the variations in the game itself. There are actually 5 different ways that you can play checkers, but it's not really that complicated. That might seem kind of complicated, but it's not. First of all, you have the 2-player, you versus opponent. And you select that by pushing you versus opponent on the keypad at the title screen. Imagine that. And in that game, there's the white players on top, uses a left-handed controller, and the blue players on the bottom and uses the right-handed controller, and the blue player always goes first in Intellivision Checkers. The other 4 variations of checkers are all 1-player games, and really it's just a combination of 2 different factors. First of all, you could decide either that the player will go first or the computer will go first. If you choose the player to go first, then you're the blue player and you start at the bottom of the screen. If you choose the computer to go first, they're the blue player and they start at the bottom of the screen. Now you pick which variation you want by simply hitting the button on the keypad from the title screen, which is you move first or computer moves first. Then after you push that button, you have a choice of a skill level, and that's the only other choice to make, and there's either a low skill or a high skill. So once you've chosen whether the computer's going to move first or you're going to move first, then you select the skill level. 2 different factors, 2 different choices, makes for 4 different games. Add in the 2-player game, and you have 5 different games. It's just that simple. Now back to a bit of the gameplay. When it's a player's turn to move, it says right on the screen, select man to move, in the color of the player whose turn it is. So we'll say that for both the white and blue player in a 2-player game, but when you're playing a 1-player game, it depends on what color you've chosen to have, whether you move first or your opponents move first. So in order to select a man to move, you'll see that there's a yellow cursor on the screen which you can move diagonally around to the different squares. And what you do is you basically just move it over top of the man that you would like to move, and you hit the select man button. How difficult is that? Once you've selected the man, the screen then changes to select move, and you can move that man diagonally in whichever direction you want to go. Once you've moved your checker to the space that you want to move it to, all you have to do is hit enter. And if you get it moved and then change your mind before you hit enter, you can hit clear. It'll reset the board to where it was when you started the turn, and you can start the process all over again. Now, if you select a man that you're not allowed to move, or if you try to make an illegal move, you'll get a loud buzzing noise and you'll realize that you did something wrong. But if you select a man that you can move, or when you finish up a move and you actually hit enter and it's someplace that you could legally go, you'll get a low-pitched bonging, so you'll know that you did it successfully. So next, let's take a look at the jumps. We all know in checkers, the object is to be next to an opponent, have an open space behind it, and jump over them. And if you go to do that, when you select that checker to move, it's going to give you the low-pitched bong saying it's legal, and then you're going to be able to move it, and when you move it diagonally, it's going to go right over top, and it's going to remove that checker from the board. In this case, if the space is open and the checkers are lined up just right, you can actually make multiple jumps and remove multiple checkers of your opponent all in the same move. One thing to remember is that if you're in a position where you can jump another player's checker, You have to do so. It's not optional, it's mandatory. And this is all part of the strategy. Because remember, sometimes you may want to sacrifice one of your checkers to put your opponent into a position where they have to jump and leave them in a place where you can jump 2, 3, or even 4 of theirs. Another important aspect, which is really kind of basic, I don't want to be under the assumption that everybody knows how to play the game, but your men can only move in one direction, and that's forward. So basically, when you start off looking diagonally, there's only 2 different spaces at all where a checker could possibly go. That being said, it's another part of the strategy. If you can manage to get your checker piece the whole way across the board to the very top row or bottom row, the closest row to your opponent's side, that's called the king's row. And if that happens, your piece all of a sudden gets crowned, and you'll see it by an actual dash that's on it. And then that checker, that piece, can move in any direction, either forward or backward, and it's much stronger when it has that flexibility of movement. So it's a very, very important part of the strategy to use your kings, they're called, crown kings, in a strategic manner to try to win the game. It's only going to be through very carefully thought out strategy using both your regular single men as well as your crown men, your kings, that you're going to be able to put your opponent in a position to capture all their men, or put them in a position where they can't move, because that'll win the game as well. It's only by great strategy you're going to be able to win these games. But I'll tell you this though, a draw is possible. If you get into a position where you can neither capture the last of your opponent's men, nor put them in a position where they can no longer move, the game is considered a draw. Doesn't happen very often, but it definitely can happen. The last feature that I'm going to talk about with regards to strategy is something that's only available obviously in computer checkers, and it's only available in the one-player game. But there's a button on your keypad that if you just don't know what to do, you can hit Computer Suggest Move. And what it will do is it'll move the cursor over top of the piece that it's suggesting that you move, and it will show a white arrow on the screen pointing in the direction that it would like you to move. Now, you aren't obligated to take that move. You can just hit clear and it'll back right out of it, but it's really kind of an interesting feature. Now, like I said right off the bat, this feature isn't available when you're playing a second player. 2-player mode, you can't get help from the computer. And if you do push that button, a little message will come up on the screen that just says, "I can help you." The graphics in Checkers are okay. The red and black board, the checkerboard, 8x8 squares, I mean, that's pretty standard. A lot of the checkerboards, even that I had when I was a kid, were actually black and red. But one thing, the blue and white, like I mentioned before, of the men is a little bit unusual. But it does create a nice contrast. You can easily see the men. The border around is very plain, bland, but again, contrast, so you can actually tell the difference. And the messages that pop up in the appropriate color. When the message is for either the white, for white, it's in white. For blue, it's in blue. And that's a really nice touch. The cursor's really easy to see because it's a nice yellow color. And also the fact that they put the dash on the once you've had your piece crowned. That's really effective as well. So overall, I'll call the graphics acceptable and definitely adequate to play the game. I didn't have any high expectations for the sounds in Checkers because, after all, it is Checkers, for Pete's sakes. But I did end up really kind of liking the sounds, and I thought they were quite ingenious, actually, because, for example, when you're moving your cursor around, it gives a little click each time you go to a different spot. And that helps you with the control to know that you're actually moving it where you need to move. It's just like a secondary feedback. And also, when you properly select a man or you make a valid move, it gives you that nice bong noise, which is the perfect contrast to the buzz that you hear when you make something that, or try to do something that you're not allowed to do. Another thing I really liked about the sounds in Checkers is the thinking sound that it plays when the computer's trying to decide which piece to move. It really is a lot better to have something like that. It's almost like a bubbling, pinging noise or song that's playing while it's thinking what move to make, as opposed to just silence. So I think silence would be very monotonous and you'd be, I don't know, I just really like the fact that it plays that sound. In the long term, is the sound going to get a little annoying? Possibly. Finally, the last 2 sounds to talk about are at the end of the game. If you lose the game, you get a Bronx cheer, and a big "you lose" goes across the screen. It's a pretty neat effect. Now, if you win the game against the computer, you get the exact opposite. You get "you win" across the screen, and it plays the victory song, which in this case is the Intellivision rendition of Rise of the Valkyries. Now, with the two-player game, you always get Ride of the Valkyries for the winner. It still plays that victory song, but it puts "you lose" in the color of the team that lost across the screen. It's a neat effect. You always get the positive sound, but the negative display in that situation. Here's a little bit of a trivia for you. See if you can remember, but Checkers is not the only game. Matter of fact, I learned about this one second, but Checkers is not the only game to use Ride of the Valkyries as the victory song. Can you tell me which one? I'll make mention of it before I finish up the video. Like I said before, I really don't think that Checkers is a type of game that could sell a cartridge all on its own in this day and age of modern gaming. But that being said, you still could play Checkers on a modern day system. It's part of Clubhouse Games' 51 Worldwide Classics on the Nintendo Switch. And that's a really interesting looking game which is available in the eShop, and I think you can also buy it in physical release. Nowadays, Intellivision Checkers is known more for its collectability than its actual gameplay. There's tons of different variants out there that are really attractive for the hardcore Intellivision collector. Not only are there 3 or 4 different of the purple box, actual Mattel or Intellivision Inc. versions of the game, but there's other variations, like, for example, the Sears Video Arcade version is one of the most desirable Sears titles. And there's also things like the French-Canadian Checkers Doms version, which is just something a little bit different. One of the ones that I find most interesting is the version that was released over in Great Britain, of course, is called Drafts. And I'd love to have a lot of those for my collection. I don't have the Sears version, I don't have the French-Canadian version, and I don't have the British version with Drafts. And I really would love to add any of those into my collection. Overall, it's just a very collectible title. One thing I am lucky enough, though, is I'm lucky enough to have recently added an autographed copy of the game into my collection. It's the original Mattel Intellivision copy, but signed by David Rolfe himself. I really love picking up these autographed copies of the games. So where would I rate Intellivision Checkers? Listen, absolutely, I love the game for its collectability. But do I really want to play it? The graphics are decent, okay? It's Checkers. It's not that complicated a game for graphics to go. And the sounds, I've already said, I think the sounds, they've done a very good job with the sounds in making it, just giving it different sounds that you wouldn't normally think about. But then again, maybe some of these sounds, time after time after time, they'd be very repetitive and get to be quite annoying. I don't know. Now, as for the gameplay itself, the gameplay does replicate the game of Checkers very accurately and efficiently. The trouble is, I didn't enjoy playing Checkers when I was a kid, and I don't feel any different about it today. So, taking all of these factors into consideration, I have to give Intellivision Checkers by Mattel Electronics a 3 out of 10 rating. Well, guys, that's it for today's episode of the 125. I can remember back when I was sort of scouting out what games I was going to do, when I was looking at titles like Checkers, thinking, what am I going to say about that one? But I seem to have found lots to say. Anyway, thanks for spending a little bit of time with me today. Don't forget to hit like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next time when I have the next episode of the 125. Take care.
Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. If you haven't grown up by the age of 50, you don't have to.
I'm Rick Reynolds of the Intellivision Aries podcast, and you're watching Papa Pete, the old guy gamer.
What?